Tina didn't know it yet, but hiring a clown for her son's birthday would turn out to be the worst mistake of her life. It was supposed to be just a small party, nothing fancy, something to make up for all the times she couldn't give Ethan what he deserved. But things don't always go as planned, and sometimes they go horribly wrong. You think you know what fear is? Wait until you realize how far you'd go to protect your kid, how little control you really have when things go off the rails. Tina was broke, and the guilt gnawed at her every day. Scrolling through her phone, looking for birthday ideas. All she saw were things she couldn't afford. Big venues, magicians, bouncy castles. It made her feel sick. Ethan's 9th birthday should have been special, but this? She was throwing together a party with dollar store balloons and a cake she baked from scratch. Then she saw it, an ad for a clown, cheap as dirt. She wasn't sure, but Ethan loved clowns. Maybe this could be enough. She tapped on the ad, and despite the creeping unease in her gut, she hired the clown. Ethan had always had a thing for circuses and clowns, watching reruns of old circus shows, flipping through books with vintage photos of smiling faces. It was weird, sure, but it made him happy. So despite that little voice telling her to stop, she booked the clown. Just this once, she'd ignore her instincts, make him smile, and be the mom who gave him something special. On the day of the party, Tina strung up the decorations in their tiny apartment, feeling that familiar wave of guilt washing over her. The homemade cake sat on the table, looking sad and small. The balloons hung like limp reminders of everything she couldn't give Ethan. The doorbell rang. It was time. Ethan's friends showed up, loud and rowdy, and the apartment felt even smaller with all the kids crammed in. The parents stood around awkwardly making small talk while Tina felt her stomach churn. She wanted this to be perfect, but everything felt wrong. And then the doorbell rang again. That's when Charlie the clown burst into the room. His entrance was big, too big for such a small space. He knocked over a chair, his oversized shoes clomping on the floor. His suit looked worn, colors faded like they'd been through one too many birthdays. But it wasn't just the suit. It was him. His grin was too wide, like he was forcing it, and it made Tina's skin crawl. She tried to shake it off. He's just a clown, right? But there was something in his eyes. His voice was off too, deeper than it should have been, like he didn't know how to talk to kids. The jokes fell flat. The kids weren't laughing, not like they usually would. Tina looked at the other parents, but they just laughed nervously, trying to play along. Maybe it was just her. Maybe she was reading too much into it. But Ethan was watching him, eyes wide, not blinking. Fascination mixed with fear. And Tina didn't like it. Something was off about this whole thing, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Charlie pulled Ethan up front, saying he had a special trick just for him. The whole room got weirdly quiet. Tina's pulse quickened. It was just a clown trick, right? She watched, tense, as Charlie started twisting a balloon. Too slow, too deliberate. The balloon stretched in ways that seemed unnatural, bending and creaking, as if it was alive. Tina's breath caught. Something wasn't right. And then Charlie pulled out a small wooden box. At first, Tina thought it was another prop for his trick, but when he opened it, her heart sank. He pulled out a knife, a real knife. She was ready to jump up, to yell, to stop this madness, but then Charlie looked at her. His eyes locked on hers. Dark, almost black, and there was something there. Something predatory. She froze. He leaned in close to Ethan, whispering something too quiet for Tina to hear. Whatever he said, Ethan went pale, his small body shaking. Tina's body screamed at her to move, but her legs felt glued to the floor. She tried to call out, but no sound came. Her heart pounded in her chest, drowning out everything else. Then in a flash, the lights flickered. Shadows danced across the walls, stretching and twisting like they were alive. Charlie's painted grin widened, his face warping under the flickering light. And then it happened. His true form. His skin cracked, pale as bone, and his eyes, those black voids, grew larger. The kids screamed. Parents rushed to grab their children, but Tina couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Charlie grabbed Ethan, lifting him off the ground with ease. Tina's voice finally came back, a hoarse whisper of Ethan's name, but it was too late. Charlie grinned, a grin that didn't belong on any human face, and made her an offer, her son's life, in exchange for something precious. Without thinking, without hesitation, Tina agreed. The moment the words left her lips, Ethan fell to the ground, limp but alive. Charlie disappeared into the shadows like he was never there. The lights stopped flickering, the screams quieted, and just like that, the nightmare was over. Or so she thought. The parents fled with their kids. Tina sat in the eerie silence, staring at her son. She carried him to his room, heart pounding, thankful he was breathing. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, something gnawed at her, twisting her insides. What had she given up? What had she lost? That's when it hit her. Charlie never said what she had to give up. And when she went to check on Ethan, he was gone. The next morning, Tina woke up with a knot in her stomach. The relief of surviving the night felt fake, like a mask covering something rotten underneath. She rushed to Ethan's room, praying that everything would be back to normal. But when she saw him, her heart dropped. Something had changed. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, eyes vacant, staring at the floor. His usual warm, shy self was gone. He barely looked at her, his face blank, cold. "Ethan?" she called out, but he didn't respond right away. When he finally looked up, it was like staring into the eyes of a stranger. Hollow, empty. Tina felt the panic rising. She tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe it was all too much. The party, the excitement, the fear. But deep down, she knew. Something wasn't right. Later that day, she found him standing in front of the mirror, just staring at his reflection. She stood in the doorway, watching. His lips twitched, stretching into a slow, twisted smile. Too wide, too forced. It looked wrong. It reminded her of Charlie, that same painted-on grin that never reached his eyes. Her skin prickled with dread, but she told herself it was nothing, just her mind playing tricks. Things got worse. At school, Ethan started acting out. His teachers called, telling her about dark jokes he was telling the other kids. Jokes about clowns and circuses, but they weren't funny. They were disturbing. He drew pictures, too. Pages full of clowns with big, terrifying grins and sharp teeth. The teachers were concerned, but Tina couldn't explain it. She couldn't tell them the truth. They'd never believe her. As the days went on, Tina realized what she had done. The deal wasn't to save Ethan. It was for his soul, and she had given it away without even knowing. Every time she looked into his eyes, she saw less of him and more of that monster, Charlie. The guilt weighed on her like a boulder, crushing her chest with every breath. She had to fix it. She had to get him back. Desperate, Tina went to a local priest, the kind who dealt with things beyond regular confession. She didn't care about the looks he gave her when she explained the story. She didn't care if he thought that she was crazy. She just needed help. The priest's face turned pale as she spoke, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, shaking. "This is darker than you think," he warned her. "You're not just dealing with a clown, you're dealing with something ancient." That night, Ethan's behavior escalated. He became violent, distant, like he wasn't even her son anymore. She heard whispers in his room, strange voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. She was too afraid to open the door, too afraid of what she might find. Ethan wasn't just acting out. He was slipping away from her piece by piece. She tried to talk to some of the parents from the party, hoping someone else had noticed. But the dumb jocks, Steve and Mark, laughed it off like it was some kind of joke. "Kids are weird, you're overthinking it," they said, chuckling like idiots. Tina wanted to scream at them, shake them, but their ignorance just made her feel more alone, more afraid. Then one night, she heard Ethan screaming. She rushed to his room, heart pounding, and found him drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with terror. "What is it?" she asked, shaking him gently. But he wouldn't talk. He just stared at her, trembling, his face pale with fear. The same fear she saw in his eyes when Charlie whispered to him at the party. That's when the strange things started happening around the house. Balloons would appear out of nowhere, red ones, like the kind Charlie had, and at night she heard laughter, eerie, high-pitched, echoing through the halls. It was faint at first, but it grew louder each night, like Charlie was creeping back into their lives. She knew then Charlie wasn't done with them. It was a few nights later when it happened. Ethan's voice changed, deeper, darker, like something else was speaking through him. His eyes glowed with a strange, unnatural light, and Tina realized what had happened. Charlie hadn't just taken Ethan's soul, he was possessing him. Tina tried everything: prayers, burning Ethan's old clown toys, anything she could think of. But the more she fought, the stronger Charlie's hold on Ethan became. She could feel the clown's presence lurking in every shadow, every corner of her home. It was suffocating. Then she remembered Charlie's offer, the deal she had made. She had to confront him. She had to renegotiate, or she would lose Ethan forever. Tina tracked down the agency that had hired Charlie, digging through shady ads and old records. What she found chilled her to the bone. Charlie had been performing at children's parties for decades, maybe longer. Wherever he went, kids went missing. Families were torn apart. He wasn't just a clown, he was something much worse. The agency owner, a wiry old man with a raspy voice, warned her. "You're dealing with an ancient force," he said. "Charlie isn't just a performer. He's a creature that feeds on fear, corrupting innocence." But Tina didn't care. She had no choice. She had to face him. She followed the clues to an old abandoned circus on the edge of town. It was falling apart, the tents rotting, the ground overgrown. But in the center, she found him. Charlie, waiting for her with that same twisted smile. He offered her a new deal, her soul for Ethan's. Tina hesitated, her heart pounding. Could she really give herself up? Could she sacrifice everything for her son? But then she saw Ethan's face, his real face, buried deep inside the darkness. She had no choice. She agreed, but as Charlie leaned in to seal the deal, she pulled out a broken mirror from her bag, holding it up to his face. The moment Charlie saw his own reflection, his twisted smile faltered. His own image trapped him, and with a scream, his form began to disintegrate, dissolving into the air like smoke. Ethan collapsed, gasping for breath. His eyes were normal again. Tina rushed to him, pulling him into her arms, sobbing with relief. It was over. The nightmare was over, or so she thought. As they walked away from the circus, a balloon floated down from the sky, landing at her feet. She stared at it, her blood turning to ice. It had the same sinister grin. Tina realized with a sinking feeling, Charlie wasn't truly gone. The deal may be over, but the nightmare was far from finished. Story 2. There's this moment, the kind that creeps up on you when you're alone, staring at the cracked walls of your life. It's not just the fear of failure. It's the idea that someone else is out there living your life, taking what's yours. Charlie sat on his sagging couch, flipping through the channels in his rundown apartment. The air was thick, stale, like the inside of a forgotten box. And there it was, Jack, grinning like an idiot on TV, performing his jokes. Not just any jokes, Charlie's material, stuff he'd worked on for years, poured his soul into. Jack was killing it, and the crowd roared. That bitterness, it hit like a punch to the gut. Charlie's hand tightened on the remote, knuckles turning white. Before he even knew it, the remote flew across the room, smashing into the TV screen with a sickening crack. The image distorted, but Jack's stupid grin lingered. The glass fractured, just like Charlie's life had. Then, Tara walked in. She looked tired, bags under her eyes from putting up with his endless frustration. She tried to calm him, saying something about letting it go. about how anger wasn't going to change anything. But she didn't get it. She never did. "You're just standing there, like always," Charlie snapped. "You never backed me up. That's why I'm stuck here while Jack's stealing my spotlight." Tara's eyes narrowed, her patience fraying. "I'm tired of this, Charlie. I'm tired of hearing you complain about Jack. Do something or shut up." She walked out of the room, her footsteps heavy with frustration, leaving Charlie to simmer in his own mess. He paced, his mind racing, anger building like a pressure cooker about to blow. He couldn't let it go. Not this time. He'd lost everything. His career, his pride. But there was still something he could do. Something drastic. Something that would make everyone remember his name again. That's when the idea hit him. He needed to shake things up, make a statement. The universe owed him a break, didn't it? He grabbed his keys and left the apartment, his mind buzzing with plans he couldn't even fully form yet. At the thrift store, Charlie wandered the aisles, looking for props. Anything to reignite his comedy career, to remind people who he was. His eyes landed on a dusty corner where an old clown costume hung, almost hidden away. It looked ancient, faded red and yellow fabric, with a mask that was more terrifying than funny. There was something about it, a pull. As he reached for the costume, the shopkeeper, an old man with a grin too wide for comfort, warned him. "Don't take that," the man said, his voice slow, almost like a dare. "Bad things come from that suit." Charlie brushed it off. He was desperate, and desperate men didn't listen to warnings. He bought the costume and left, the shopkeeper's creepy smile still etched in his mind. Back home, Charlie locked himself in the bathroom, holding the costume like it was the answer to everything. There was something powerful about it. Exciting, even. Like it was offering him something, whispering promises of revenge, of reclaiming his life. He slipped into it. The fabric clung to him, tight, suffocating. When he looked in the mirror, his reflection twisted. His face stretched into a smile he couldn't control, and a laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside. It wasn't a regular laugh. It was wrong. The laughter grew louder, manic. He clawed at the costume, trying to rip it off, but it was like the fabric had fused with his skin. Panic gripped him as the costume took control, feeding on his insecurities, his anger. Tara heard the noise, the wild laughter echoing through the apartment, and rushed to the bathroom. She found Charlie in front of the mirror, twitching, laughing like a madman. She reached out to help, but he swung at her in a blind rage, his eyes wide, lost. "Get out!" he screamed, a brief flash of control breaking through the madness. Tara hesitated, confused, but fear took over and she ran, leaving him alone. Alone with the thing that was becoming a part of him. The voice came next, low, mocking inside his head. It told him to seek revenge, to make Jack pay. The costume tightened, pushing him toward the inevitable. His thoughts were no longer his own, twisted by the costume's whispers. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen, the laughter still spilling from his lips. He wasn't just thinking about revenge anymore. He was revenge. Driving to the comedy club, where Jack was performing that night, his grip on reality slipped further. Memories of Jack's betrayal, how he'd stolen Charlie's material and left him in the dust, played on a loop in his mind, each one feeding his rage. At the club, Charlie walked in unnoticed, the clown costume blended with the crowd. Just another joke. But no one knew the punchline that was coming. His cackling grew louder as he watched Jack on stage, performing his jokes. The audience laughed, completely unaware of the danger creeping toward them. Charlie stood, his body moving without his control, a puppet to the costume. He staggered toward the stage, his eyes locked on Jack's. Confusion crossed Jack's face, but it was too late. Charlie leapt onto the stage, pulling out the knife. The audience gasped, some thinking it was part of the act. Jack backed away, his confident grin faltering. He tried to reason with Charlie, insult him like he always had when they were partners. But words meant nothing now. The costume whispered darker thoughts, pushing Charlie forward. The stage lights flickered, casting shadows that danced on the walls. Charlie lunged at Jack, the knife slashing through the air, barely missing. The crowd realized this wasn't a joke and fled in panic, screams filling the room. But the moment came. The split second where Jack, standing there cornered, managed to say something. "Charlie, you idiot. This was never yours. You always were, just the warm-up act." And then it clicked. The costume wasn't driving him to kill Jack. It was driving him to see what he really was. A joke. Jack stood on stage, the spotlight harsh on his face, beads of sweat forming on his brow. It was just him and Charlie now, circling each other like two animals ready to strike. Jack, as always, couldn't resist the taunts. "You were never funny enough, Charlie. You were the warm-up act at best. That's why you're wearing that ridiculous costume. You've always needed a gimmick." Charlie's response was pure madness, unhinged laughter echoing through the emptying club. His voice cracked, wild and out of control. Inside, Charlie fought to make sense of what was happening, but it felt like the costume had a mind of its own. His thoughts slipped to Tara, just for a moment, and he hesitated. Could he stop this? Could he take control again? But the costume tightened, gripping his body with a force that made his skin crawl. It wasn't letting go. Not now. Suddenly, Charlie flung the knife across the stage. It clattered to the ground far from his reach, and he collapsed to his knees in front of Jack, sobbing. But the sobs were mixed with that awful laughter. The costume mocking him for his weakness, for even thinking he had a choice. "You're pathetic," the voice inside whispered. The laughter was louder now, filling his ears, drowning out his own thoughts. Jack took a step closer, convinced he'd won. "You'll always be a loser, Charlie," he sneered, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Then he turned his back, the ultimate insult, the final dismissal. That was the breaking point. The costume surged with power, sending a jolt through Charlie's body, forcing him to lunge forward. Before he could stop himself, his hands were around Jack's throat, squeezing tight. His fingers dug into Jack's skin, feeling the pulse of his enemy beneath them. The mask cackled, louder than ever, feeding off Charlie's rage, his desire to be more than just a forgotten name. As Jack struggled, gasping for air, Charlie's eyes caught his reflection in the mirror backstage. For a moment, he froze. The person staring back wasn't him anymore. It was the clown, but not the one he'd put on. This was someone darker, something monstrous. The smile was wider, more grotesque, the eyes hollow, as if they were looking right through him. Jack's body went limp in his hands, collapsing onto the stage. The laughter grew louder, vibrating through Charlie's bones, as the mask's grin stretched impossibly wide. Horrified, Charlie stumbled back, realizing what he had done. He'd crossed a line, one he couldn't come back from. Desperately, he clawed at the mask, trying to tear it off, but it was fused to his skin now. No matter how hard he pulled, it wouldn't budge. It was like trying to peel off his own face. He was trapped. Panicked, Charlie fled the club, his mind unraveling with every step. He ran through the dark, deserted streets, the city's lights blurring past him. His own laughter echoed off the buildings, mixing with the eerie voice of the clown in his head, taunting him, mocking him. He stopped in a dingy alley, panting, his chest heaving with exhaustion. In the shattered glass of a broken window, he saw his reflection again. The clown's face stared back at him, those soulless eyes boring into his. This wasn't Charlie anymore. It was something else, something darker, and he couldn't escape it. Out of nowhere, two dumb jocks stumbled into the alley, reeking of booze and bad decisions. They saw Charlie in the clown costume and started laughing, thinking it was some late-night street act. "Nice one, bro! Where's the show?" One of them slurred, his words barely forming through his drunken state. Something inside Charlie snapped. The costume took over completely. He lunged at the jocks, his body moving faster than his mind could process. At first, they laughed, thinking it was still a joke, until they saw the look in his eyes. The laughter died in their throats. Charlie's movements were quick and brutal. He knocked one of them to the ground, sending him sprawling into a pile of trash. The other tried to run, but his drunken legs betrayed him, stumbling as he tried to escape. Charlie stood over the jock he'd knocked down, the knife in his hand again, raised high, but instead of striking, the costume forced him to laugh. The sound was deafening, filling the narrow alley, bouncing off the walls like some kind of twisted melody. The jocks managed to scramble away, one of them pulling out his phone and snapping a picture before disappearing into the night, but Charlie didn't notice. He was too busy laughing, his body convulsing with it, unable to stop. The next morning, Charlie woke up in his apartment, the costume still clinging to him like a second skin. His mind was foggy, the events of the night before a blur. He tried to tear the costume off again, but it was no use. It was part of him now. Tara came back, though, her eyes filled with worry and anger. When she saw him, she screamed. Charlie tried to explain, tried to tell her what had happened, but his voice was muffled by the constant, unrelenting laughter. Tara didn't stay to hear him out. She ran out the door, this time for good. Charlie collapsed onto the couch, his life in ruins. He turned on the TV and there it was, the clown's face. His face. Every channel, every news report, talking about the laughing killer. The viral picture had spread like wildfire. People were horrified and fascinated. In the end, Charlie realized there was no escape. He was the punchline now, the joke that would never end. The mask grinned wider, the laughter echoing in his mind. He'd become the punchline of his own joke, trapped in the costume forever. And with that, the laughter never stopped. It was the final punchline. The one no one saw coming.